Welcome to the forum. My name is John Howell. I'm the Deputy Director at the Institute of Politics. I want to welcome you here this evening. I think we have a very interesting discussion ahead for you. We've had a little preview over the last few minutes at the Institute of Politics. I think the discussion this evening should be very interesting, despite the fact that the recent affair in Panama has disappeared a little bit from the daily paper for most of us who are lay readers of the paper. However, the implications of the action in Panama are certainly being discussed and debated widely from Boston through South America. And our hope tonight is that we can add just a little bit to that debate and discussion. The Institute of Politics is very pleased to be co-sponsoring this event tonight with our own Student Advisory Committee. The Student Advisory Committee plans, organizes, and executes a wide number of events for the Institute of Politics. And I'd particularly like to recognize the work of two individuals who have made this event happen this evening, Evan Grayer and Dan Hoffman. And a round of applause for the two students, please. I've got the easiest role this evening. I introduce the introducer, and then I sit with you and enjoy the discussion. We are very pleased tonight to have Professor Shane Hunt from Boston University. Professor Hunt is a professor of economics at BU. He specializes in Latin American affairs and has for a number of years. He has a particular interest and field of study in trade policy in Peru. However, he is here tonight because of his interest and expertise in Panamanian affairs. Professor Hunt?
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here. I think that perhaps I'm here this evening not for my expertise, but because I'm known to be a moderate fellow. The dinner discussion that we had just before this meeting, those of you who are there, I think will agree with me that it was quite lively, and we expect this evening session to be lively as well. And one reason we do expect it to be both lively and interesting is that the Institute of Politics has assembled this evening a very interesting and distinguished panel, which represents a variety of different viewpoints about Panama and about the U.S. role in Panama. I would like to introduce briefly these gentlemen to you now, and then introduce them more fully before they speak. Closest to me is John Maisto, the Deputy Permanent Representative of the United States to the Organization of American States. Next to him is John Meyerson, the producer of the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather. And at the far end of the table is Mario Rognoni, the leader of the Senate minority in the Parliament of Panama. They will speak in alphabetical order, and therefore Mr. Maisto will be the first speaker. John Maisto is, as I said, currently the Deputy Permanent Representative of the U.S. to the OAS, a position which he has had for about a year. And before that, he was for 3 years in Panama as the Deputy Chief of Mission in the U.S. Embassy in Panama. He has a long and distinguished service mostly in Latin American posts for the U.S. Department of State. He has served in Manila, in San Jose, Costa Rica, in La Paz, Bolivia, in Cochabamba, Bolivia, and in Córdoba, Argentina. He has a degree from the School of Foreign Service of Georgetown University, and also a master's degree in Latin American history from the University of San Carlos in Guatemala. I'm pleased to introduce to you Mr. John Maisto.
Thank you. In 1979, the United States signed Panama Canal treaties with Panama. At the time, we looked to a trend, and we looked to, Panamanians looked to Latin Americans look to. A 10-year transition from the military regime that existed there to democratic and civilian government in Panama through 2 elections, 84 and 89. The basic U.S. foreign policy thrust at the beginning of that period, in the middle of the period, and at the end of the period was very simple. That U.S. foreign policy interests are best served with democratic governments, particularly with our friends and where we have important interests. Our policy must reflect our values. U.S. interests are best served in Panama with a democratic government, not a military dictatorship. And in addition, there are some practical considerations. In the 90s, the United States must arrange for giving the Panama Canal over to Panama, complying with our treaty in the year 2000, and moving out of military facilities there, also per treaty. General Torrijos had a commitment to this. He died, and then things began to get unwrapped. There was a flawed election in 1984, but nevertheless, we hung in with a policy of carrots and sticks to do what we could to move Panama through the transition to democracy. Back in 1986, the ambassador at that time gave a policy speech in which he said the principles of U.S. policy are that the United States will comply with the Panama Canal treaties, support the transition to democracy. The 89 elections will be key. The election playing field in 89 has to be level. Freedom of the media, political association, and human rights must be guaranteed, and in order for all this to happen in the way that it should, the Panamanian military must be apolitical. The Panama crisis began in June of 1987. Civilians reacted, went into the streets because of revelations of the number 2 man in the Panamanian military, and the regime of Noriega immediately began to point the finger at the United States as being the cause of all the problems because the United States didn't want to comply with the treaty, keep the Panama Canal, not give it over to the Panamanians, and to keep our military presence. What was interesting about that episode was that this didn't go down with the Panamanian public. It was not credible. The crisis went on, and on February 4th, 1988, a watershed event took place. Noriega was indicted for drug running and money laundering in the United States. So the problem changed from no longer being that of the transition of a military dictatorship into a civilian government in Latin America, but one of being a narco-military dictatorship. That was something that General Noriega and the people around General Noriega really didn't quite comprehend. What I'm talking about is the seriousness of U.S. resolve with regard to the gravity of the drug problem and what the United States has to do to attempt to resolve it. Our policy, however, remained unchanged. We were hoping for change from within. The civilian president attempted to fire Noriega after he was indicted. He got kicked out himself. There was a military coup. There was a nationwide strike. We attempted to negotiate Noriega out. That wasn't possible because Noriega said no. We developed some pressures, economic pressures. We had hoped to develop a variety of other pressures, but for bureaucratic reasons, they didn't pan out. But the economic pressures were targeted economic pressures. They were not, we didn't have an economic blockade of Panama. We prevented people in the Noriega regime from doing business with the United States and from benefiting from business relationships with the United States. But the Panamanian economy was open to dealing with the United States. There were very targeted sanctions. Nevertheless, the economy, which had started its downturn when the crisis started, went tumbling down. We looked to a 27% drop in GDP in Panama in 2 years. Noriega's game plan was very simple. Hold on to power at any cost. Nothing moved in Panama. The pressures didn't work in terms of getting Noriega out. They did weaken the regime. An election was coming up, the famous 1989 election, and we supported a policy of a level election playing field, urging people to come in and observe the Panamanian elections, and the Panamanians resolving their own political problem themselves. The May 7th, 1989 election was Noriega's biggest political mistake. Well, there was a second biggest mistake he annulled the elections 2 days later, and then there was another one. He beat up on the opposition in the streets, and the whole world saw the nature of the Noriega regime as far as free and fair elections were concerned. We went into a phase of multilateral diplomacy. The Organization of American States attempted to mediate the problem, arrange for a transition of power in Panama. It was a long, very difficult summer. But although the OAS was able to condemn Noriega, isolate Noriega, name him as responsible for Panama's problems, was unable to get him out. The OAS opened the door for Noriega to leave, but that particular international body, and perhaps no other, or any other, wasn't able to find the political wherewithal to do something more substantial in terms of allowing the election results in Panama to stand and Panama to make its democratic transition. Not long afterwards, there was another attempt to force Noriega out in October of 1989. And that failed as well. Between October 1989 and December of 1989, the situation began to drift, deteriorate. Noriega lost control of his own military on the one hand, and yet on the other hand, he had people loyal to him who were responding to him doing things. Let's do a quick review of what had been attempted after the political crisis began internally in Panama, which had nothing to do with the United States. It had to do with revelations of wrongdoing in Panama in the previous years. The civilians tried through civic action, power in the streets, to force Noriega out. Didn't work. There was political and economic pressure, and all of 1987, a carrots and sticks effort by the United States to persuade Noriega and company to get back on the road to a transition to democracy. That didn't work. The president attempted to fire Noriega. He got kicked out himself. Force from within, March 88 coup, did not work. Negotiation did not work. A continued combination of political and economic pressure did not work. A free and fair election did not work. Multilateral diplomacy did not work. More force from within did not work. Further isolation by the OAS in not even referring to the regime in Panama as a government, the South African formula, didn't work. Noriega's final mistake was that he either declared or allowed to be declared war against the United States. His puppet assembly declared that the state of war existed. Well, one could consider that rhetorical, except for the fact that his people started killing U.S. personnel in Panama. This was the culmination of about 2,000 treaty violations from the year 1980, from early 1988. The President of the United States made a decision, and it was in a very simple, straightforward way. He said, enough is enough. Things will only get worse, and in order to safeguard U.S. lives, which is a primary responsibility for the President of the United States, to defend democracy, to help Panamanians make their transition to democracy, as they had attempted to do through the 1989 presidential election, to combat drug trafficking, because remember, this is the first narco-military dictatorship, and to protect the integrity of the Panama Canal treaties, which makes Panama different from other countries. We do have treaty obligations to keep that canal open. The United States used force in Panama. There's some questions for us all to ponder. For example, what do international organizations like the OAS do in this narcotics era in which we live when a criminal element takes over a country? Does it wash its hands? Does it say, because of the principle of non-intervention, nothing can be done? There is nothing more sacred than the principle of non-intervention? What is the responsibility of the international community in a situation like this? Then we have to ask ourselves, what is the responsibility of the President of the United States in terms of his oath and his responsibility to protect American lives? There's not much time left. I hope in the question and answer session we can get into the future for Panama. I think Panama's future is positive and bright for a variety of reasons that we'll get into. There are two problems to resolve on the ground: how to deal with the Panamanian military, which is being debated in Panama right now, and the immediate problem is jump-starting the Panamanian economy, because that economy is in much better shape than the economies of other Latin American countries that would have gone through something like this, and certainly much better than the economies of the Central American countries. And finally, with the poison of the Panamanian problem finally drawn, and what looks like a resolution of problems in Nicaragua and maybe even El Salvador, and perhaps even Guatemala, is there a possibility for Central America to stop being a liability on the world stage, and particularly in terms of the foreign policy interests of the United States, and move into something more positive? That's a question I hope that we can address when the questions and answers begin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Maisto. Our next speaker is John Meyerson. John Meyerson was a producer for CBS Morning News in the early 1980s. He was a producer in CBS News in Chicago in the mid-1980s, and he has been a producer of the evening news of CBS since 1987. In this role, particularly the latter role of CBS Evening News, he has covered a variety of dramatic events throughout the world, and one such event was the indictment of Noriega, and another event was the invasion of Panama. He arrived in Panama just as the military forces arrived also, and he was part of the news. I dare say he was even on the CBS Evening News as a result of having been taken prisoner for a number of days with great concern about his whereabouts. Mr. Meyerson, in addition to his journalistic experience, has also been a student of Latin America. He studied at the University of Chicago both journalism and Latin American history and politics. I'm very pleased to introduce to you Mr. John Meyerson.
Thank you. I'm lucky to be speaking between John Maisto and Mario Ragnoni, because if there's anything I don't know about Panamanian policy, they'll be able to tell me about. I want to talk a little bit about the media's role in the Panama invasion, the U.S. media in particular, because I think there's an important lesson to be learned from this. This was very much an example of the power of the American media. CNN in particular, but also CBS, ABC, and NBC, were all viewed in Panama, courtesy of Armed Forces Television. And because of that, while I was a hostage, I was able to watch the coverage of the invasion. And I watched it with my captors and my fellow captive, Doug Mullen, and we shared a few observations about the invasion, which I was then able to take back with me and think about since then, and we've also learned a great deal about how the invasion was covered and what it says about how the media covers invasions, what our responsibility is, and whether, in fact, we should be criticizing U.S. policy, and perhaps why there wasn't a little bit more analysis and criticism of what happened down there. What happened was, for the 2 days after we were taken hostage, we were in a house in Panama, in the countryside, and saw various scenes that we found a little bit unsettling. The first scenes on American television, CNN in particular, showed us U.S. troops landing over and over and over again. I think there was about 30 seconds of video that had been released, and it very much gave people the impression that this was a heroic action by U.S. troops as they landed on the beaches, and pictures taken in the choppers. There was no footage of casualties of any kind of civilian dead or, for a while, of U.S. military dead. This we found a little bit puzzling. It was also then followed by rather grim scenes of looting and what you could only describe as anarchy in the streets. I think that this gave people the impression that things really were not under control. And in fact, they may have been under control, but by repeating these scenes, it led our captors to believe that things were very unstable and that in fact Noriega may still have been in power. At the same time, CNN played a tape of Noriega over and over again, his last radio address. He was long gone by then, but the impression again created was that perhaps he was out there somewhere. The combination of all of those things, the lack of reporting on civilian casualties, the tapes played over and over again, led us, and I say us, I mean the captives and the captors, to share a view of a world in which everything was delivered to us by television. And sometimes that message is a great one when it's a revolution in Eastern Europe and you can watch the Romanian government falling, but sometimes it's a dangerous one when you're covering an invasion, because what it's telling you is messages that aren't always correct. There was supposed to be a way to handle that problem, and that was a U.S. media pool, which was organized by the Pentagon. There have been pools for about 5 years now. They began after the Grenada invasion, when there was so much of a complaint about the lack of coverage. Reporters were not allowed into Grenada. But what happened in this case, the pool has worked and has functioned in the past, but what happened in this case was the pool did not arrive in Panama until 4 hours after the invasion began. So instead of going in with the first wave of troops, the 16-member pool was called in way too late to get into the action. And in fact, last month, the Pentagon issued its own internal report, which criticized Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney for excessive concern over secrecy. Once they were on the ground, the pool was not given any kind of support by the military, and it turned into something which now sounds almost comical. There were seasoned journalists forced to sit and watch, unable to go out because there were no helicopters provided, unable to transmit information to the United States for lack of telephones or fax machines. Now, the author of the report, Fred Hoffman, is a former AP Pentagon reporter and Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs. In this report, he criticized Cheney for not trusting the pool to maintain secrecy before the invasion. In his report, Mr. Hoffman said, "Unless the Defense Department's leaders are prepared to extend that trust in hot war situations, the pool probably will be of little value." A few days after the report was issued, however, Secretary Cheney told reporters in a speech that he decided to delay the call out of the pool until after the evening newscasts were over, in other words, after 7 p.m., because he was concerned about a, quote, premature leak that would in fact compromise the security of the operation. "I made the right call," said Cheney. But one of the members of the pool, Fred Francis of NBC, described the situation this way. "The pool was repeatedly denied or ignored when asked for access to frontline troops, wounded soldiers, or even simple interviews. When pool members asked to leave military headquarters at Quarry Heights, where they were practically captive for 36 hours, to cover action against Noriega's headquarters, they were told it was too dangerous. So I would ask, why were they there in the first place?" Even more absurd and sad in a way was the second invasion of Panama, this time by the rest of the American press corps. 169 news-starved journalists carrying 10 tons of equipment came in on a chartered jet the next day, once the Pentagon had deemed the situation under control. They arrived at a Howard Air Force base where one master sergeant apparently looked at the unruly gang and announced that they would not be permitted into the city, reportedly, again, for security purposes. The journalists were kept at Howard for 2 days. Many never got beyond the perimeter of the base. and the remaining group was airlifted back home with only their dirty clothes to show for the adventure. But for the journalists who did stay, unfortunately, the situation didn't improve. Logistically, it was horrible. They had to sleep outdoors or on park benches or picnic tables at Quarry Heights, and they covered the war. But what they did was cover a war that was presented them by military public relations officers. This is something that concerned me while I was watching it, and I've noticed a great deal since I got back. That we were supposedly there to watch the Army, but what happened was more often it was the Army that was watching the press. And at times we seemed to resort to unrelenting pack journalism. The journalists down there were safe, but they weren't reporting the story. Even more troublesome, the lack of access, instead of leaving many journalists outraged or incensed, seemed to make them more passive rather than hungrier for the story. We seemed to go along with the Pentagon's plan. Granted, the situation was still dangerous in the street, but the coverage often came dangerously close to cheerleading for the U.S. side. Again, there was an absence of casualty figures for a couple of weeks. I think that during the first 2 weeks after the invasion, only 2 network news pieces that I saw focused on the civilian death toll. Only one newspaper, the Spanish-language publication in New York, El Diario, devoted its front page to a photo of dead Panamanians in the city morgue. Most of the post-invasion coverage focused on the tabloid headline news hook, "What's become of the drug-running general?" The surrender of Noriega from his rock and roll blasted asylum at the Papal Nuncio was the big story, not the civilian dead, not the condition of Panama after the assault, and not the question of how the Panamanian government would rebuild the country. And I would suggest that too much of the media bought into the administration's idea that we were simply going in there to take out a drug thug, when in fact it was a much larger operation than that. And I think that if you look at Noriega as a drug-running murderer or whatever else you want to call him, his abuses, when compared to some of the abuses in the rest of Central America, particularly Guatemala and El Salvador, may pale in comparison or or something close. What I'm worried about is that we seem to go along in support of the invasion too much. There was very, very little reporting about what was going on outside of the military operation, and when it came to reporting any kind of international criticism of the invasion, except when it came from the Soviet Union, Cuba, or Nicaragua, we ignored it. And with them, it was almost as if to say, well, what did you expect from them, from the Soviet Union, Cuba, and Nicaragua? Of course they're going to criticize us. In the early hours of the invasion, I noticed reporters and anchormen back home did voice a certain amount of concern about Yankee imperialism and another Vietnam. I'm going to just wrap this up. They asked me if I would like to see the United States invaded by Panama. They defended Noriega. They saw him as a man who provided jobs. And they weren't cheering for the invasion, though I know that many Panamanians were. And they wondered why we were. After all, they said they wanted the same things that we did: peace, independence, and jobs. There was some initial skepticism over Operation Just Cause, as it was known. But my concern now is that the media did not do enough of a job, good enough a job, of analyzing what was going on in Panama, perhaps even criticizing it, and to this day is more or less ignoring the Panama story because the headlines have moved on to other parts of the world. And I hope that we can do a better job of paying attention to what is happening in Panama.
Thank you very much, Mr. Meyerson. Our final speaker is Mario Rognoni, a Panamanian. Mr. Rognoni has a degree in industrial engineering from Georgia Tech. He is a senator in the Republic of Panama. He is the leader of the Senate minority. He was the Minister of Industry and Commerce in 1988 and 1989. He has been a professor at the Catholic University for many years, and he is, in addition, formerly a news director for a television channel and president of Note Radio, a radio station in Panama. Mr. Mario Rognoni.
Thank you very much, and I wish first to thank the opportunity to be here tonight with all of you. In 1977, Panama started a new relationship with the United States after signing the Torrijos-Carter treaties, which ended the 74 years of confrontation over the Panama Canal. By these new treaties, Panama would gain full sovereignty and total control over the canal by the year 2000. The U.S. was also committed to help develop a professional defense force for our country, which was in turn to be responsible for the total defense of the canal by the year 2000, when the United States would close all their military installations in Panama. Parallel to this signature, General Torrijos committed himself unilaterally to establish a democratic government in Panama in a 6-year step-by-step plan. As per his determination, immediately political prisoners were freed, exiles were allowed to return home, freedom of the press was allowed, and the legalization of political parties was done after 10 years of illegality. Partial elections for the Senate were held in 1980, and general elections were called for in 1984. Torrijos' death in 1981 did not stop the democratic process, and the 84 elections were won by the United States suggested candidate Nicolás Ardito Barletta, which was former vice president of the World Bank, and whose election was recognized immediately by the United States and his inauguration attended by Secretary of State George Shultz, even though the election was close and widespread notions of fraud were evident. Weeks before Barletta took office, then President Illueca failed to renew the School of the Americas Agreement, of interest to the Defense Department of the United States, and whose renewal had been assured by General Manuel Antonio Noriega. Barletta's tenure was short. Social unrest and his inability to get financial assistance from the United States gave way to public manifestation, and eventually his forceful resignation pressed by the PRD, the political party of the Panamanian military, after shortly less than 1 year in office. This was a clear sign to the United States that Noriega was departing for the democratic commitment. To the United States, Noriega had to go. The path to his removal is well known: character defamation through the media, leaks of wrongdoings, agent of the CIA, double agent, and finally an indictment on drug trafficking. The United States got involved simultaneously with the Panamanian opposition and openly intervened in the internal affairs of our country. Many mistakes were made because of overestimating the opposition and underestimating the government support groups. Betrayals were promoted, coups were backed, and eventually even the authority of the Economic Powers Act invoked as to sanction Panama and weaken our economy. The ordeal was long and hard for the Panamanians that saw its economy dwindle to the point that eventually they would welcome an American intervention to stop the economic pressure. Political figures were banned to make business or come to the United States. Pressure was put to countries and financial institutions that traditionally held Panama. Panama was being isolated. It was hard to believe that the United States would go through so much with an ally just to get rid of one man. What else was really at stake? To us, the United States wanted several things. A, to renegotiate the canal treaties. B, to assure themselves the military bases past the year 2000. C, to dissolve the highly nationalistic Panamanian defense forces to be replaced by more submissive forces. D, to assure bilateral agreements concerning money laundering controls and extradition for drug traffickers and U.S. sought felons. And E, to save face on the issue of Noriega. That is why they never really had a plan to kidnap or kill Noriega. It always was a complete change of government into a highly dependent one to the United States, plus the elimination of the Panamanian Defense Forces. The stage was set finally by late 1989. Panama's economy was dangerously low, social unrest reaching a peak, and then December 20th. The enemy, smaller in size than Delaware, with a defense force smaller than the New York City Police Department, with total population barely over Atlanta's. The army that came in with highly sophisticated, some yet unproven weapons. 30,000 men in all attacked Panama. In the end, 3,000 to 5,000 Panamanian dead, over 7,000 prisoners of war, which were mostly physically and mentally tortured, over $1 billion in losses to Panama's private enterprise, 200,000 today unemployed, 14,000 war refugees homeless that add to the already deficit of 150,000 homes in Panama. The occupying troops went beyond what was expected. They searched and destroyed private properties. They confiscated documents from government offices, from private homes and offices, from political parties. They would enter and then allow looters to cover up their ransaking. No law, no legality, nobody to complain to. They killed the wounded. They buried in common graves our dead. They built the largest POW camp in history and slowly simply took over running the country. But the worst happened from the beginning. They swore and installed the new democratic government in a military base in Panama, in front of an American flag. That is why the new government gets no respect from the Panamanians. That is why it cannot be recognized by Latin American countries. The American intervention in the internal affairs of Panama had gone from supporting the opposition to weaken the government and finally imposing a government by the use of military force. Few believe that you can impose democracy by force. First, we have to understand that what is good for one country not necessarily is good for the next. Each nation has its history. Each nation has to find its own political solution. What the invasion brought about is the sad reality to Panamanians that the Americans feel they can intervene in our country regardless of Panama's right to self-determination and independence. It seems as if the end justifies the means. But can anybody really justify an invasion? Would any American justify an invasion of their own country for any given reason? What right does the United States have to impose any form of government into another country? The United States has now planted the seed of hate in the heart of Panamanians. What happens next will depend on the course of action from now on in American foreign policy. Are the Americans willing to pay for all damages done by their sanctions and the invasion itself? Are they willing to allow the Panamanians to run the country with their virtues and vices? Will the American aid help solve the deep social problems? Will the United States go after the real objective now, or will they keep the democracy charade for a while? Can the Panamanians really believe in the U.S. intentions if the U.S. at one point backed Somoza, the Shah of Iran, South Africa's apartheid, betrayed Taiwan, and gave so many signs of simply acting based on self-interest in their own foreign policy? But we have to look forward. Eventually, the fear will wear out in Panama. The truth will come out over the invasion and what really happened. The U.S. will make their next move toward their real interests, but Panama has to face the problems of lack of housing, lack of funds for education, the need to start employment plans fast, the problem of a government that has given every sign of not believing in a true democracy anyway. With 62% of the votes, according to their own figures, they took 86% of the Senate seats. They appointed a new Supreme Court completely, changed all the judges and prosecutors. They intervened 8 radio stations, 2 television stations. They closed 4 newspapers. 599 political figures of the now opposition have been indicted and subject to jail terms. 220 personal accounts have been illegally frozen. That is the democracy the invasion brought us. I'm one of 7 senators in the opposition, fighting 51 of the new democracy. The United States also risks that once the appreciation because of the overthrowing of the government wears out, Panamanians will turn against them because of the invasion and the events thereafter. I believe it's in the best interest of both nations to do the following. A, immediately withdraw all the U.S. Army troops from Panama except for the stated in the Torrijos-Carter treaties. B, the United States should pay full indemnization to Panama on losses by the invasion and events thereafter. C, the United States has to stop intervening in Panama's internal affairs and state clearly their commitment to respect the Panama Canal treaties. And D, the United States has to stop any form of intimidation, harassment, or threats to Panamanian political figures on whatever side. Gentlemen, your country made their shares of mistakes in growing up. Allow us to make ours. You had slavery. You had separate but equal. Your women couldn't vote. You had imperialism. You had assassinations of presidents. You had invasion of neighboring countries. You had your share of skeletons in your closet. Allow us to be free and to make our own mistake in growing up. Don't impose democracy with tanks and bombs, with death and missing. Yesterday, the U.S. was denouncing Tiananmen. Today, you criticize Russia for Lithuania. With what moral right if you just invaded Panama? We learned to like and respect the United States. We believe in the American dream. But is today's America the America of Jefferson, the America of Washington, of Lincoln, of Kennedy? The United States had to stop intervening. Democracy is more valuable when it comes, as it's doing in Poland, East Germany, and Hungary. Your actions in Panama risk that gratitude will turn to hate, appreciation will turn to rejection. Panama wants to be partnered with the United States, but we want to eventually be a full democratic country, but step by step. Let me finish by stating that I am a Panamanian, proud, nationalistic, not anti-American, but aware that if the United States does not correct their policies toward Panama, we're going to reach situations that we will all regret, because no matter how small our country can be, we know that bullets will never kill ideals. And paraphrasing one politician, which we greatly respect, that came from this part of your nation, we will not get mad. We'll get even someday. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Onion. Now it's your turn. At the microphones. Would you please, there is a microphone here and a microphone there, and I hope you will not be reluctant to get up from your chairs. I hope this gentleman is a good example to you all. Yes, sir.
Yes, I am a Panamanian citizen. My name is Alfredo Suascum. I am in the faculty of the medical school here, and a member of Physicians for Human Rights. I would like to ask two questions of Mr. Oñoni, and then maybe one that Mr. Oñoni and Mr. Maisto could answer together. I am appalled at the speed of your delivery, Mr. Oñoni, which is quite helpful to glance over a great deal of misstatements, and really, I don't want to call them untruth, but I'll give one very short example. You mentioned the dismissal of a president, Mr. Barletta, as purely a political problem. It was the result of a murder of Dr. Espadafora. I hope Mr. Meyerson can sympathize a bit for that one death. I'll be short. The question I would like to ask of the offended patriotism and nationalism of Mr. Oñoni is how can he reconcile his patriotic fervor at present with his unflagging loyalty to somebody who always was in the service of foreign governments. He was in the payroll of several foreign governments. And how could you talk about sovereignty when you and your government handed our country to the international narco-mafia? I don't know how to reconcile those two statements. In terms of the future, yes, Lincoln and Jefferson and Panama and Noriega, they don't seem to go hand in hand. I hope we can find better examples in our country. But in terms of the future, the question about to Mr. Maisto and Mr. Oñoni is, why is it? Because I truly fail to understand that the United States seems to devote so much effort in helping militaries. You know, the Caribbean and the alliances between, yes, the Somozas, Trujillos, Torrijos, Noriegas, and the United States have been proverbial. And I don't think that kind of alliances are in the best interest of our countries. I wonder why it persists, and I wonder if anything has been learned.
Thank you. 2 questions. Two questions from Mr. Mr. Rognoni, and 1 question from Mr. Maestro there. Yeah.
Yes, very briefly, it's a matter of opinion. I feel that Dr. Valletta was going to resign or be forced to resign even if Espadafora had not been murdered. It had already been discussed at the PRD, it had already been discussed with the military, and it was just a matter of picking the right time. Originally, he was going to be resigned, quote unquote, on October 11th. As you know, Panamanians believe in dates. On the second hand, the reconciliation that concerns it depends on the intentions of the people. I never held public office until '82 for the first time, and I never held public office because I told General Torrijos once, which was also our friend, that I could never be part of a government that was strictly military, where no political parties were allowed, and where civilians didn't have a role to play. Once he got his commitment towards the new Panama and the 6-year plan, we then approached the military and said that we would be part of the new political party and we would be part of the new democratic process and trying to help them. Unfortunately, many things happen, of course, in 10 minutes. You cannot summarize them all, the worst of which was the death of General Torrijos. I am convinced that had Torrijos not died in '81, in '84 he would have relinquished full power to the elected government or whoever had been elected. But it didn't happen. He died. We went through one general, Paredes, that wanted to go back to the military regime, and then Noriega, which everybody knows the end of the story.
The question about U.S. assistance to military in Latin America, not only in Latin America, in other parts of the world, is a very good one. The United States for years has been attempting to use its influence on military establishments in country after country to persuade them that they must be subservient to civilian rule, they must support democracy. We've won some in a great many countries. We lost one in Panama.
While you go up to the microphone, let me take the chance to ask a question of my own to Mr. Meyerson. In connection with the military's dealings with the press, they had a system in Grenada, there was complaint, the system changed. In the case of Panama, has there been complaint, and is the system likely to change in any way?
Well, the complaint was the one that
Excuse me, aside from your complaint
no,
this evening.
well, the complaint was made by the Pentagon itself in its own internal report. Pools are bad things, because what they do is create a situation where the media is completely controlled by the military, and the military has to watch out for the media and is in a position of having to protect it from its own best interests. So I would like to see the situation changed, but I doubt that it will be. Something interesting in the case of Panama is apparently President Bush asked that the pool be made up of reporters who were already in Panama. There were about a dozen or more who were down there, including myself. But Secretary Cheney vetoed that idea because he wanted it to be a Pentagon pool from the Pentagon, because he felt, I think, perhaps it could be better controlled.
My name is Christopher Mannion. I'm from the Boston University Center for Defense Journalism, and I have a question for Mr. Maestro and Mr. Rognoni. Both of you have touched upon the Panama Canal treaties. Gave them different dates of having come into effect, but I think we all agree that they are now, in the future, a lingering problem for the governments of the United States and Panama. And I think that they were ever since the beginning of the crisis, which Mr. Maestro placed in the spring of 1987, which I would place earlier with the death of Dr. Spadafora, because it was in December 1986 that the Senate first turned down an initiative to stop aid, the military aid to Panama. It was proposed by Senator Helms. And then in the spring of 86, December 85, they turned down the initiative. January 86 and February 86 saw Marcos and Duvalier go. And then the spirit started to rise and people started to think, well, what about some other countries, including Panama? Interestingly enough, when the Senates, where I worked at the time, started to make initiatives towards looking at Panama, our major obstacle towards any change in our policy towards Panama was the State Department. And in fact, Mr. Abrams came to the hearing on Panama and the future of Panama in April 1986 and commended the Panamanian government for the wonderful cooperation they were giving us with regard to the control of drugs, drug trafficking. The Panama Canal treaties were really the private reason why no one wanted to do anything, because they saw this as nothing more than a sham to revise or to throw out the Panama Canal treaties. And so I will ask, given the existence of the DeConcini Reservation in the American version of the treaties, given its absence in the version of the treaties that were signed and delivered in Panama, what will happen in the year 2000? Which version, Mr. Maisto, do you think the Panamanians should observe? Mr. Ragnoni, which version do you think the Americans should observe?
If I understand the question correctly, the United States should comply, will comply with the Panama Canal treaties, as we will comply with the treaties as ratified by the Senate of the United States.
You have brought up a very interesting point, because that has been totally undecided in court yet. To Panama, the DeConcini Amendment was never ratified by the Panamanian people. Not only, it's totally unapplicable. It makes most of what we agreed on the treaties not able to be put into effect. We have the problem that Panama does not, or at least the previous government did not want to bring about an opening of negotiations over the DeConcini Amendment, because that could open the whole canal treaties. So in a way, we have been waiting to play it by ear as events unfolded. One major event, of course, is the appointment of the new administrator of the canal, which is supposed to be a Panamanian starting January 1st. But thanks to the DeConcini Amendment, the Americans were able to give special duties to a chief engineer that is now practically running the canal instead of the administrator. So that is a problem that will have to be faced by the two nations, and on how can the treaties be applied with or without the DeConcini Amendment. To the Panamanian people, it should be applied without the amendment.
I'm Len Bushkoff. I'm a freelance journalist. I'm really stunned by the presentation that all three of the gentlemen gave, which seemed to meander off into vague issues. Mr. Maestro gave us a very disingenuous and rather elegant State Department view. Mr. Myerson told us of some of his personal experiences and referred to civilian casualties without ever giving us a figure. Mr. Ragnoni gave us a highly politicalized views and gave us an intensely high figure for civilian casualties. He spoke of 3,000 to 5,000. Mr. Myerson, how many were there in your estimation?
Well, that's a good question, and one that we discussed in the dinner before this.
Well, why don't you discuss it with us now?
There is some dispute as to how many there are. In fact, this doctor here would be able to answer you better, because there is I'd like you to answer that question. I believe that the figure, one of the reasons the figures are not known at this point is because nobody has really bothered to go and find out. And in fact, that's one of the great missing links in this story. The figures may either be 300, 400, 600, 2,000, 4,000, or as high as, I've never heard the number of 5,000 to 7,000 before. Your group was just down there and says, what, 300? Well, I think that's a good point because what happened is in the chaos, in the fog of war, there was a great deal of confusion. I guess my question would be, why did, if the number is, let's say, 200 or 300, why did so many have to die in what was supposed to be quite a controlled operation?
I'm a mid-career student here at the Kennedy School, and my question would go out to anyone that would like to answer it. I believe a point's being missed in terms of the general foreign policy of the United States towards our neighbors to the south, and some may say it's a general foreign policy of a lot of countries about any neighbor to the south, and that just geographically they are geographically above another country, and therefore countries to the south are subservient, Africa to Europe, South America, Southern Hemisphere to the United States. But some as well may say it's the United States imposing east-west policy in a north-south situation. But in general, the United States foreign policy towards Latin America, Central America, and South America have been nothing but intervention throughout its history, the 1820s, Texas, 1840s, Chile, you name it. They've been in all of them. And my question is, what major barriers need to be overcome for the United States to change its attitudes in foreign policy towards our neighbors to the south?
Please.
The first thing that the United States would have to do is to start respecting the Latin American countries. Historically, for some reason, the United States does not feel like Americans in the sense of the whole continent. They look and they feel more like Europeans transplanted into this continent. They feel with very little